think we're at 5 minutes after the hour. I think we can go for it. Good morning or afternoon or evening or wherever you're coming in from. Welcome to the IAESS, the International Association of Education, Science and Snow Sports webinar series. I'm going to kick it over to the Vice President of the IAESS board, Pete Allison, to get us started.
Great, thanks, Dave. Welcome, everybody. Great to see everybody online, and very excited about this webinar. I've got a couple of things, but we'll keep this nice and short. Just a quick intro to IAESS. Rolls off the tongue really easily this morning. International Association for Education and Science in Snow Sports. We are one of the three pillar organizations of Interski, and you can see on the screen right now, hopefully, our mission. That's what we focus on. We do that in a number of different ways, which I'm just going to briefly go through. This is a recent picture of the board or the presidium in Levy a couple of weeks ago, where many I notice lots of people on the call were in Levy as well, so you can see the board. Number of those different people are on this call right now. We also have a new website, a relatively new website, thanks to Vanessa and Dave and their hard work to build a website. We have lots of resources there. That's one of the main ways in which we achieve our aims of connecting theory and practice. We've got some images on there, and we have a number of recordings of previous webinars as well. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available on there too, for people to watch afterwards. So if when Paul says deep, profound and wise things, you can go back and listen to it multiple times over and listen to those things again. So we do a number of these online seminars or webinars. We also provide infographics, which you can find on the screen, kind of quick summaries of research articles. And then we also create and develop projects, networks, and exchange programs. A few of those to mention, or the kind of three main ones that we have that we're working on at the moment. Ski Easy, which is pioneered by Rado Pichot, who is on the call right now. We're also doing some work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also some work in sustainability as kind of hot topics, if you like, in snow sports. We're always looking for people to contribute and people to be involved. So if you're interested in offering a webinar, or you want to contribute an infographic, or any of those kinds of things at any time, or if you've got ideas of what you would like to see, please do get in touch with us. You can see on the bottom of the screen there the specific website information, but it's easy to find on the website. The general website homepage is there on the screen right now. We also have a Facebook page, which is the old name of IBSS, and we have Instagram too. So please follow us on there, and feel free to kind of share posts amongst your respective countries and snow sports communities. We're open to everybody for all of this information. We kind of want to share information. We recently had a General Assembly in Levy at Interski, which was a big success. We have a series of these webinar events on the horizon that we're in the process of programming over the next few months, and then we'll take a break over the summer if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, and then again in the fall or the autumn, we'll kind of pick those up again and do some more of those webinars. Today's webinar, Exploring the Characteristics of Person-Centered Delivery by Paul Garner. We are delighted to welcome Paul, and very thankful for him offering to do this, or responding positively to our approach. Paul has an international reputation for research and applied interventions in coach development. His research primarily focuses on the relational element of coaching, supporting coaches and coach educators in their intra and interpersonal knowledge, culture development, and leadership. Having represented Great Britain as a member of the British Alpine Skiing demonstration team, he's worked extensively in snow sports as a performer, coach developer, and assessor. Paul continues to work closely with a number of governing bodies, including the British Association of Snow Sports Instructors, BASI, the British Equestrian Federation, Great Britain Rowing, Table Tennis England, the Professional Golf Association, England Lacrosse, and he focuses on driving excellence in coach education, coach development, and assessment across the coaching landscape. I am delighted that Paul is doing this, and having been on the receiving end of Paul's coaching on more than one occasion, I think we're in for a fascinating presentation here. So thank you very much for doing this, Paul. We really appreciate it. Paul is going to talk for about 40 minutes, something like that, and we'll take questions as we go through, and then we'll kind of deal with questions at the end. So if you want to put a question in the question and answer function of this, we will host those at the end. Thanks very much, Paul. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Pete. Talk about building me up. Crikey, I didn't realize you were going to read that out.
No pressure.
It was just going to be in a handout or something, but sounds very grand. Right, if I could share my screen there. So it's let me just get this up. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, we've got it.
Okay. Fabulous. Well, thanks, Pete, for that introduction. Thanks to everybody for inviting me to come and talk. It's quite humbling, really, to be talking to so many people from around the world. Probably slightly less scary staring at a screen than it would be if I was standing in a room in front of you all. So there's one small thing for me to be thankful for. But yeah, great to be here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing with you essentially what has been my work or my research over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. But I think really this goes back way before that. It goes back to the early days when I started in coach development, and I think really probably goes right back to childhood days, you know, and where my interest sits in people. So before I get into the research, I think it's important for me to just almost put a disclaimer out that I'm not here to give you absolutes this evening or this morning, depending where you are. I'm here, I suppose, to shine a light and to share some of my ideas and my thoughts around something which is essentially pretty messy, pretty complex. You know, how we understand people, how we deliver education, development, support to people. So we're unlikely to find absolute answers and definites. Most of my work takes a sort of an interpretivist type lens, and I'm the interpreter. So I think it's really important when we're doing that kind of work that we understand the context, that we understand the context of the research, and I'll share that with you. But I think it's also important that we understand the researcher and where they're coming from. So it's perhaps a bit of a strange way to start this presentation, and I was in two minds as to whether to go with this next slide, but I'm going to go for it. So I thought, just share a little bit of my background, where I've come from, really. So I was one of 4 boys, so the eldest of 4 boys, brought up by a teacher and a nurse, so a fairly standard upbringing. I went to a pretty standard state school. I was in a family that loved sport, so sport's always been a huge part of my life. You can see me there as a very young rugby player, and then on a bike that's too big for me. So sports was a huge part of my childhood. And so were people, part of a big family, trying to understand my position in that family and how to deal with, certainly 5 male voices around the dinner table wasn't always an easy thing to manage. But I ended up leaving school, going to university. And when I finished my degree, I ended up in the Alps. I found myself in the Alps. And that's where I started my BASI journey. And after a little while doing that, ended up setting up a ski school in Val d'Isère with the 3 other guys in black that you can see there. That was back in 2002. And I guess that experience of setting up the school in concert with my work as a trainer, that my appointment as a trainer happened about the same time. So for the last 20 years, I've been embedded in that environment. For the last 10 years, I've also been working at the University of Gloucestershire and more recently the University of Birmingham. So I relocated from living in the Alps full time in about 2012 back to the UK and started an academic career, which has really allowed me to make sense of a lot of the thoughts and ideas that I had when I was skiing and working as a trainer full time. But it was really that experience of running a school, I think, that triggered my interest in this kind of idea of treating people rather than athletes, and looking at people rather than athletes, and trying to understand how we can really get the people side of it right when we're either working with ski instructors to help them be better instructors, or whether we're working with clients to help them be better at skiing. And it was about 10 years ago when some of the coaches that worked for the school in Val d'Isère came to me, and we were talking about training and staff training. And, you know, they valued the Friday afternoons that we spent skiing as a group. So we'd go out every Friday and ski as a team. I'm sure lots of you do something similar. But they also expressed a little bit of frustration that they'd finished their journey through BASI. They were fully qualified, and they didn't really know where else to go to develop as teachers, as coaches. And we looked at, you know, what was going on in the school, and on the rare occasion that we ever had a complaint or a client that wasn't happy, it was never because people weren't good enough at skiing. It was never because the instructors didn't know enough about skiing or that their skiing wasn't good enough. Yet that was what we focused on a Friday afternoon. So we thought, well, what is the root of the rare problems that we would face? And it was always around people. It was around not reading the client, or not negotiating the goals properly, or a bit of a personality clash, or, you know, it was something that was often intangible and difficult to put your finger on. So that really, I think, triggered my interest. And when I started working at the university, still very involved with the ski school, still involved with BASI, but located back in the UK, that's where my research journey really sort of started to focus on that area. Now, something that some of you will be familiar with, and if you're not familiar with it, I certainly find this very useful, this model, and this is something that's steered my thinking. And this is a model for expertise, and it's a model for expertise that's been developed specifically for coaching, came out of Canada. Again, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with Jean Cote's work. So Cote and Gilbert in 2009 essentially identified 3 bodies of knowledge that they argued an expert coach or a highly effective coach would have this knowledge. So the first body of knowledge that they talked about was professional knowledge, and this is essentially our knowledge of the discipline. So for us, it's knowledge of skiing, ski technique, tactical awareness, understanding the environment. It's where some of the ologies might sit. So biomechanics, psychology, sociology would sit in that professional knowledge. We might apply this to other industries as well. So, you know, a lawyer needs to know the law. So discipline specific knowledge, which, you know, I think we would all agree is pretty foundational to what we do. But they also identified 2 other types of knowledge, which is really where my interest sits. So our intrapersonal knowledge, our ability to understand ourselves as practitioners, our strengths and our weaknesses, and understanding the emotions we experience, understanding the impact that we have on other people. So that ability to be introspective and reflective is equally as important as understanding our discipline. And then thirdly, and this really is where I started my journey, is our interpersonal knowledge. So our ability to build relationships, understand people, to manage all the different stakeholders that we come into contact with when we're working as an instructor or an instructor trainer, or you know, when I'm working at the university, we talk about coaches and coach development. So, you know, depending on the sporting context you're in, that could be parents, administrators, other coaches, clients, athletes. You know, there are so many people that we have to interact with that our ability to deal with that is really important. So Cote and Gilbert said, you know what, if we have an integration of those three knowledges, and depending on the context that we're in, then we should be able to affect some pretty useful outcomes for our athletes. So today we're not going to talk about skiing, which would be our professional knowledge. We're going to talk about our interpersonal and a little bit of our intrapersonal as well. So I'm going to take you really through two studies that have underpinned my doctoral research. So I finished writing this up. I'm on the cusp of submitting, hopefully get this over the line this summer. So this is work that's been going on since 2018. I started this journey. The first study that I published was in 2020, and then the more recent one in 2022. So I'm going to talk through both these studies and really just explain where that journey's taken me, where that's ended up in terms of my thinking. This is work that I'm sharing with BASE. So BASE are very open to looking at how we can integrate this into our systems, into our processes, into our resources. It's also work that Pete mentioned some of the other bodies that I work with. So I've used this already with Table Tennis England around their coach assessment. It's features as part of the golf degree that I'm delivering at the University of Birmingham. And I've used it with equestrian and rowing coaches as well. So, and also used it in Zermatt this autumn with some instructors that were working for a school in Zermatt. So it's fairly new, but it is being applied, which for me is really exciting. So here we go. So the first study that I did was essentially trying to understand what person-centered behaviors look like. And in this study, I was looking at BASE trainers. So this was a group of trainers that were delivering courses. I guess I started off asking, well, what does good delivery look like? And then I thought, well, you know, I know we're trying to put the learner at the center of what we're doing. So what does learner-centered behavior look like? And then as I've worked through my thesis, I've settled pretty firmly on the terminology person-centered as opposed to learner or athlete-centered, which is we often see in the literature, and I'll perhaps talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So trying to understand how these trainers behaved. And as I said, I'm not here to give you absolutes. There are holes in this, and there's an interpretation to everything. But I made a pretty strong case for the four trainers that I observed, that they were expert in what they were doing, and that they were certainly trying to deliver in a person-centered way. They'd come through a system that had prepared them to do that. They were highly experienced. They delivered the course they were delivering multiple times. They'd all delivered at Interski, so they'd been on that international stage, both as a performer and a deliverer. So there were a number of criteria that I had there to include people in this study. And as you can see, four participants is a pretty small study. But what I did is collect a lot of data with those four particular participants. So I used a tool, which I'll share with you in a minute, to collect structured observations, and really was using a leadership lens to try and understand how the behavior mapped across the course. So the sort of key findings were that the behaviors changed as the course continued. So for those of you unfamiliar with BASE courses, we run them as a continually assessed course. Now, although the assessment is continual, as we reach the end of the week or the 2 weeks, depending on the course, there tends to be, even though we try to avoid it, there tends to be a little bit more focus on the result. Are people going to pass or fail? And so there's a little bit more of an assessment flavor towards the end of the course, even though it's a continually assessed process. And what I found was that at the beginning of the course, the behaviors aligned very strongly with a transformational leadership approach, which was one of the models that I was using to observe behavior. So transformational leadership is kind of characterized by what we might see as typically person-centered behaviors. So lots of sharing of responsibility, lots of questioning, involving the learners in the learning process, lots of support, lots of choice, lots of autonomy. So those types of behaviors characterized the beginning of the week. But interestingly, as we moved into the assessment, the period of the week where it was a little bit more characterized by assessment, we started to see the behaviors of the people delivering the course move towards a much more transactional space, where communication was a lot more direct, there was less feedback, there certainly were far fewer questions, less choice. And that was really interesting. And if we look at the literature, it would suggest that is a less sustainable way to behave, and arguably a less effective way to behave. So, it threw up some questions for me there. It also raised the importance of context and how behavior changed with the change in context. Now, when I spoke to the people that were receiving this behavior, so the candidates on the course, it transpired that actually this was very closely aligned with what they wanted. They liked this. They liked the clarity that they got with the transactional behaviors, the directness. It wasn't done in an authoritarian way. It wasn't done in an uncaring way, but it brought clarity to the process, and it was deemed the right thing to do. So this really sort of contradicted some of the stuff that a lot of the stuff in the literature that would really suggest the transformational approach was perhaps superior. So the idea that context really changes our effective behavior was something that I found really interesting. And actually, talking to the deliverers, what was fascinating was that their behavior changed, but their intention was still very person-centered. So what the reason they were behaving in that way was quite calculated. They were doing it on purpose. So I guess I came out of that first study having used this as a tool. So this is the tool that draws again on some of Jean Cote's work. Jen Turnage was one of Jean's PhD students who and this came out of her PhD. So this is the coding structure that I used. So you can see that the behaviors in green, the leadership tone behaviors 1 to 11, saw lots of those types of behaviors in the early part of the week. And then we dipped into the yellow behaviors as we went more towards assessment. Interestingly, there was also some red behavior. So there was a little bit of anger and hostility that came across, which, using this as a tool, I was marking that down as something that was definitely undesirable. If we look in the left-hand column there, it's termed toxic. But again, talking to the people that were on the course, I'm not going to go into the details of the incident, but when the coach educator displayed this anger, it was displayed towards somebody who had endangered his group. So the people in the group were quite grateful that this person had expressed their anger. So arguably the intention was still person-centered. The trainer was protecting his group, and the outcome of this was that they felt protected. They felt that he cared for them. So in some ways there was a transformational effect that came from what we might observe as toxic behavior. So the results of this study were not confusing, but they raised lots of questions. And I was frustrated because I thought, sorry, I'm going to go back a slide. I thought this was such a useful tool, and it is, but it's imperfect. And when the context changes, we sometimes need to use behaviors that we perhaps wouldn't deem necessarily to be the best behaviors. So I asked this question of myself, is there something that we could help to guide behaviors that is not dependent on context? So when we're working with Daisy trainers and when I'm working with coaches in other sports, I find it quite frustrating if every time we give them a guide, we say, here's a guide, but do you know what? It depends on the context. So we end up going, well, there is no guide because the context is always changing. The individual that we're communicating with is always changing. and that feels a bit frustrating. So I started to settle on this idea of intention and the intent that underpins behavior. And could we explore that in more depth? Is there a consistent intention that might result in a whole array of different behaviors, but we could really focus on the intention? So this is where I'm going to ask you to stay with me. This might get a little bit academic, but I'm really keen just to share with you the perspective that the second paper came from. Okay, so that was the first paper published in 2020, and I think it threw up some really useful results. But really, what it's done is it's inspired the second paper. So, how do we understand coaching? So, in terms of the kind of perspective that this second piece of research has come from, is I'm not prepared to settle for understanding coaching purely through observation, which is largely what I did in that first study. It was dictated by observation. So some really interesting work that was initially put out there by Bhaskar around critical realism as a perspective, which is essentially saying that, the world is laminated. Okay, there are different layers. And very often the layer that we concentrate on is the layer that we can see, the layer that we can experience. And if you put yourself into the position of a Bayesian trainer or a trainer in whatever country you work in, we assess ski instructors going through their different qualifications, and we do this almost entirely through observation. And that gives us a certain amount of information, and we make our judgments, and that's the way we've done it. But if I think about study one, my observation, I was observing behavior that I thought was substandard, but when I talked to the people, I found out why they did it. All of a sudden I thought it was a good behavior. So I think there's a flaw if we're just looking at behavior through the lens of observation. So Bhaskar's model suggested that there were three layers to the way we could understand what we see. So the deepest layer being the layer of the real. Okay, so this is things that have the potential to make things happen that we might observe at the layer of the empirical. Okay, so when I read this work, I thought, well, that's intention. Okay, I have the intention to do something. That intent has the potential to create a behavior which has a positive or a negative impact on my learner or on my athlete. Now, I think the middle layer, the actual, is a little bit confusing, but that is when we bring our intention, or the layer, the real, we bring our intention into reality. It actually happens, and then we experience it at the layer of the empirical. Okay, so my second study, what I'm really interested in now is trying to understand things at that deeper level. Okay, at the layer of the real, where we're trying to understand what's going on in people's heads. Okay, rather than just observing behavior. So the second study was really trying to find something useful. Okay, so again, this is my last academic slide, I promise. So just stay with me. We see an awful lot of research that's done in and around pedagogy and learning and coaching. And we see a lot of it that's not done in skiing. So that's one thing. So I'm really pleased to have been able to do some research in skiing, so we can hopefully underpin our practice with research that's conducted in our sport. But a lot of the work that we borrow from, a lot of it is either done from the left-hand perspective, so from a positivist perspective where we're trying to prove things, so we measure things. A lot of research comes from that perspective. Or if it's not, it comes from the other end of the scale, where we end up having that moment where we say, well, it depends, and it's very interpretivist. So really what I'm trying to do with this second paper is find something that we can hang our thinking off, something that's useful, something that we can say, okay, this might not be the absolute truth. Truth is fallible, but this is our best attempt at a truth for now. So looking for a model, something that we can hang our thinking off. And I think that's important, because when I share the outcomes of the second study, some of you might be thinking, well, yeah, but this is just, you've just spoken to a few people, you've just observed a few people. How can we transfer these findings to lots of different environments? Well, you know, I'm not claiming this is flawless. I'm not claiming to be at the left-hand end of the spectrum here, where I'm proving something. I'm trying to find something that's useful. It is fallible. We need to keep looking at this. Okay. So the second study was essentially, as I said, trying to go a little bit deeper. So what I did was I attached a GoPro camera to a learner that was working with a coach. I use the word coach loosely. So we had some basic trainers in this study, some instructors working with intermediate skiers. So we had one private lesson, one group lesson, we had some instructor training, and we had some assessed courses. So we had an array of different environments. But with each of the people delivering, there was a learner in the group who had a GoPro camera on their chest, and we had the camera rolling for the whole day. So that learner captured all the interactions between the coach and the learner throughout that day. So I had a lot of footage by the end of this process. Now I cut the footage down so that I just had the interactions. So I cut out all the skiing around bits, and I used that footage to stimulate an interview with the deliverer. So I sat with each of the 5 participants and said, look, I'm going to play you a clip, and I'd like you to tell me what was in your mind when you behaved in that way. When you did that, why did you do that? Were you aware of a thought process that triggered that behavior? That gave me a lot of interview data. So then I cut that interview data down, look for themes, and that's really what's revealed the outcomes of the study. So the key findings were there were sort of 4 key components that came through that were guiding decision making of these coaches. Now those 4 components, when I look at the literature around humility, they align really closely with definitions of humility in the literature. So not so much the dictionary definition of humility, but you know, there's a big body of work around humility as a virtue. And the 4 components that came out of the study align pretty closely with those definitions. So here we've got the sort of the results, the 4 main themes on the left. There were some sub themes and there's some data extracts. So I'm not going to go through everything on the slide. This has just been taken from the paper, but I will I'll quickly just talk you through the main themes and the sub themes. So there was an other-centeredness to the decision making, which perhaps not surprising. If we're trying to be person-centered, we're going to see a focus on the other. So this really was characterized by doing what was right for the learner as opposed to what was convenient for the deliverer, and it enabled a number of sub themes. Okay, so I found this interesting, that having this other-centered intent enabled the sub themes, as opposed to the sub themes enabling the other-centered intent. But it really enabled the coach to build trust with the athlete or with the group. It enabled learning to happen through structured autonomy. So this was an interesting sort of thing that came out of the study, because they were looking to deliver in a way that was right for the other. They're trying to foster autonomy in their learners, but putting the right amount of structure in to make that work. It enabled an accurate social assessment. So because they were thinking about the other, they were able to pick up emotional cues. They were able to pick up how their learners were feeling, how their learners were responding to the rest of the group and to the messages that were coming from the deliverer. It allowed them to build trust, and it allowed them to use humor in an appropriate way. Okay, so there were no examples of sarcasm or humor that put others down. So there was self-deprecating humor, and there was a kind of shared humor, but the other-centeredness really facilitated that. Second theme was an accurate self-assessment. So this was the ability of the the coach to understand their role. So what was it they were trying to do? You know, and interestingly, there were some occasions where the person delivering was working with people that they also worked with. They were very clear that they weren't in a work environment. They were in a course environment, so they had a different role, and they were acutely aware of this, and they were explicit with that, and they shared that with their learners. There was also lots of examples of the coaches being aware of their own abilities, so their shortcomings, but also their strengths. And I think that's really important that we understand what can we bring to the party, but also where do we need to develop. There was a willingness to learn, so this really came through, I suppose, as a vulnerability or an openness to being vulnerable. It came through with the coaches apologizing if they made mistakes. It came through as being prepared to say, I don't know the answer, I don't know everything. So that was a really clear finding. And then finally, there was clear perspective that drove behavior. So I think really you could liken this to a camera lens. So at times the camera lens was just very, very wide. Okay, so rather than being focused on the session and the moment, the coach was able to open the lens and see the big picture. So see perhaps development across the whole season, or even beyond the season, across a number of years, and understand the background of that learner and how their background perhaps affected the way they learned and took on information. So that wide-angled ability to take a wide-angled view of things, but also the ability to perhaps put a different lens on and put the lens of the learner on, so to see things from somebody else's perspective. So we might talk about being empathetic there, but really being able to understand how somebody else is interpreting things. So they were the 4 themes that came out of the second study. And I'm sort of nearing the end of the presentation here, because what I've done with those 4 themes is I've tried to create a model that we can use in coach development, either as a thinking model or as a reflective model. So I've reordered them so that we've got an acronym POWER, POWA. And I suppose what's interesting here is, looking at those 4 values or ways to capture intention, I thought, well, crikey, it's a big ask for people to have these 4 things all the time. We're humans, and we're unlikely to behave in a perfect way all the time. Is it realistic to ask people to do this? So in my reading, I ended up going back to some ancient Greek philosophy and drew upon some of Aristotle's work. So Aristotle talked about, a lot of his work was around what it meant to be virtuous. So how do we lead the good life? And essentially that's what I'm interested in here, is how do we be a good coach? How do we be a good person as a coach? Now, Aristotle suggested that to have virtuous behavior, we need to have a balance. And we need to have a balance between doing too much and too little of something. Okay, so initially he talked about physical health. Okay, and he talked about the fact that he gave the example of eating too much. If we eat too much, we're not going to have excellent health. If we eat too little, we're not going to have excellent health. So we need to have that balance. So he argued that the average position, the mean, is excellence. That's how we get excellent health. And he argued that it was the same for virtue. So if we take courage as an example, if we have too much courage, we're foolhardy, we're rash, we're crazy. If we have too little courage, then we're a coward. We see cowardice. So courage is that for us to be virtuous, we have to have that balanced position. So I tried to apply this what is called the doctrine of the mean, Aristotle's doctrine of the mean. I tried to apply this scale to my 4 person-centered intentions. So I came up with, well, what would the deficiency and the excess be of these 4 virtues? So for perspective, if we don't have enough perspective, we're deficient, then we end up being blinkered, and we fail to see perhaps some of the important stuff that's impacting the athlete. Too much perspective, if we get too carried away with that, we become unfocused, and that's equally as unhelpful to the learner or to our ability to be person-centered. If we're other-centered and we don't do that enough, then we're self-serving, we're being selfish. Interestingly, if we do that too much, so if we go over the top with our intention to be other-centered, then we might argue that we're becoming servile. We're kind of the doormat. We get walked on and we say yes to everything. And sorry, this slideshow's got a mind of its own. You know, and that's equally as unhelpful, because we end up not being able to help people because we're downtrodden and we're exhausted, and we see burnout in coaches. So I think that's something to avoid as well. A willingness to learn. If we don't do that enough, then we're closed-minded too much, and we try and learn everything, and we scratch the surface rather than having that balanced position. And then finally, an accurate self-assessment, really, we contrast that very often with being arrogant. Okay, so we clearly would aim not to be arrogant if we're being person-centered, but equally it's unhelpful if we put ourselves down, or if we undervalue what in reality we could bring to our learners. So there's a real focus there on accuracy, and that's not always something that's easy to do. It's something that we would need to support coaches through if we were looking to develop people's ability to be person-centered, help people to be accurate in their self-assessment. But I think very often it's equally as unhelpful to be self-denigrating as it is to be arrogant. So it says on the slide there, where are you? And I've started to use this scale with coaches. So I'm working with some golf coaches at the moment. I sat with them yesterday, and they delivered a session last week, and asked them to plot on each of the 4 scales where they thought they were when they delivered their session. Okay, now it might be that we're perfectly balanced. It might be that we're right on it, we're wonderful, but more often than not, we'll probably recognize that we're either left or right of center, maybe just by a tiny bit. But if we're looking to develop our ability to be person-centered, this gives us a way to go, right, okay, I need to nudge towards the middle on this spectrum. I was slightly deficient this week. So as a reflective tool, I'm starting to use this, and I'm starting to see some real value in trying to cut through some of the complexity that perhaps I started this presentation alluding to. We're working in a complex environment, and this brings a little bit of clarity to our thinking, and it links our intention to our behaviors. So the final thing I was going to share with you is work that this is a proposal really in terms of how we might use this in BASI, but I've used this with table tennis coaches. So this is really taking the first study and the second study and weaving that research into an assessment grid. So if we were watching a coach deliver a session and we wanted to assess that session, I've had some success with this as a tool. So really what we're bringing in here, if we go back to this slide, we're bringing in the empirical level. So what do we see and what do we observe? But we're also bringing in the layer of the real. Okay, so we've also got the 3 different knowledges that I started off talking about. So we clearly need to assess somebody's understanding of skiing. We're going to do that largely through observation. We're going to understand their interpersonal interactions largely through observation. But then if we can also assess that individual's understanding through reflective conversation, then we can start to understand their intention. So I don't know whether I've gone over or under the 40 minutes. I'm just looking at my clock. I think I'm more or less on target there. So I'm sure I've probably lost you in parts of that, but hopefully some of it makes sense. And I would be thrilled if there are some questions, because I've had enough of listening to my own voice. Dave, over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Paul. Yes, we'd love to open it up for some questions, and you definitely nailed it on the time also. So
luck, more than good judgment.
Wonderful. I figured you'd want another face to look at as well for a second. Oh, and there's Rado back also. So
great.
We can, You're welcome to use the Q&A, and or if you do have a question, you can we can actually allow you to unmute your mic. Just let us know. Happy to do that. Here's one. Are you aware of the Curtin Adaptation Innovation Inventory, KAI, classifying the cognitive style of a learner?
I can't say I am.
Okay.
No, but it sounds interesting. So if the person who asked that, if they'd like to send me some information on that sounds like an interesting thing to have a look at.
Yeah, it's coming in from Magnus. And Magnus here, let me see if I can actually, if you want to chime in, Magnus, I think I just allowed you to unmute yourself and say hello if you'd like.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I can't get my camera working today for some.
I don't think you'll be able to get your camera working, but you can certainly, we can hear you talking, so.
Oh, there you go. No, yeah, it's fairly old. This Curtin KI, I think it's from 76 or so, but he's basically classifying cognitive style or preference of learners or students as to how easy it would be for a prolonged period of time to present yourself as a learner preferring to be well, more or less adaptive or innovative. And I think there would be some stuff in there that could interest you.
Okay, well, thanks, Magnus. I'll certainly have a look at that. I think classifying people in terms of how they learn is perhaps a contentious issue that we could spend a long time talking about. I certainly think it's really important that we try and understand our learners, and I think more and more I'm encouraging coaches that I work with to, if they have a learner who classifies themselves as learning in a certain way, I encourage the coach to negotiate with that learner to try and coach them in a different way, so that we create a rounded learner rather than sort of pandering to what they think is their preferred learning style. But certainly Curtin's work sounds interesting, so I'll have a look at that.
Yep.
Thank you,
Magnus. Sasha, do you want to unmute and ask your question? I'd rather have you just ask it in person than me try to read it.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you really for a really nice presentation. I was just wondering what I already said, write down. Actually, from study 1 and study 2, you have a not so big sample, but I'm wondering either there are also females observed or just male coaches, because probably that could be a little bit differences in the behavior when we speak women and men. What do you do? Yeah,
A really good question, Sasha. So it's something that we're continually frustrated with at BASI, trying to have more female trainers, and we're very aware that the number of female instructors as we go through the system reduces as we go through the system. So there was one female participant to this study, and as you say, it's a small sample size, so I haven't made too much of this, but this particular coach was very, very tuned in, in some of the sub themes more than some of the other coaches. So the ability to have an accurate social assessment is the terminology I've used. So the ability to understand the emotion coming from the learner. This particular coach was very tuned into that. Very, very balanced in their other centeredness. So there was one example in particular, I think, where this particular coach was very clear with the learner that the learner should not book another lesson, but should go away and practice. And I think somebody who was less person-centered would probably be looking to get another booking. So there was some really nice evidence there, I think, of putting the learner really at the center of things at their own expense.
Mhm.
But it's a good question, and yeah, I think you know, this work was all to try and drive my PhD forward, but as I come out of that, I'm really keen to try and use this model in lots of different environments, so we can hopefully refine it or consolidate it, understand things in more depth, different sports, males, females, older, younger, different cultures. So I think, you know, there's lots of scope to play with this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Thanks, Sasha. Here's a great question from Andrew. He says, thanks for your presentation. Really appreciated the background and details about the study. Your points about context are so important and well presented. My question is, where next with this work? And the second question is, what did you find to be the most challenging aspect of your coding?
Okay, well, I'll go with the last question, the last part of the question first. So, I mean, the coding tool was designed to be used with video footage, sitting in a room. Okay, that's how it was designed to be used. A 15-minute extract of video coaching, and it's intended to be used systematically, where we're coding the behavior every few seconds. Now, I spoke to Jen Turnage, who designed the tool, about using it in the field, and she helped me adapt it. She sort of trained me to use it in the field, and it's interesting that there is a recent publication about adapting the class model to use sort of global coding, I think is what they call. So that the most challenging thing was to do it on the hill. I had 5 days on the mountain with a coach trying to code every single interaction. So, you know, that was challenging. And on the first day I was doing that, I was on the phone to Canada saying, Jen, I thought I had this completely sorted, but something's just happened. I'm not sure how to code it. So I kind of had Jen on speed dial for the first few days. So yeah, that was challenging. You know, and then just the volume of coding data that you have really was a challenge. So the other part of your question was, where next with this work? So I'm finding that there's potential to use it in lots of different environments. So, as you know, Andrew, I'm working at the University of Birmingham, so we're looking to use this model as a tool to help us think about the way we supervise research students. Okay, so I think really we could use this as a thinking model for any environment where we're trying to help people, where we're working with people, trying to develop people, whether it's sport, whether it's business, whether it's education, you know, wherever we are. So I'm just keen to use it and see if it works for people in a number of different environments, because there's always a danger that it just feels good to me because I've spent 5 years thinking about it. You know, if it's going to have any value, it needs to work for other people. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for taking the time. Really helpful.
Thank you.
Looks like we've got one more here from Emily. The coaches you observed, did they have different profiles, e.g. Gender, age, experience, nationality, background? And then she asks a second question, do you think coaches' behaviors change when they are being observed or being watched on a GoPro? Okay,
so the first question, probably not as diverse as we would like, just by the nature of the sample of people that I could draw from. So as I've said, largely male, British, because that was my go-to sort of body of people. So I think that's something to look at moving forwards, going back to Andrew's question. A little bit more diversity in age, so probably the age ranged from early 30s through to 50. And background, again, I guess similar background in so much as they've all come through the BASI system. So in that respect, not an awful lot of diversity. In terms of the behaviors changing with the GoPro, so I think inevitably you put a camera on somebody and they think about it, but the fact that the camera was rolling for the whole day and the fact that there wasn't somebody there, so I wasn't there, I went and had a coffee while all this happened, you know, I wasn't following them around. This is in the second study. The camera was lodged there on the learner. It just ended up looking like part of the jacket. So I think it had less impact than it might have had if we'd been filming somebody, you know, in a different environment. I think coaches are quite used, people working skiing are quite used to having cameras around. So I think the impact was minimal in terms of changing their behaviors.
Great. Thanks for that question, Emily. I don't know if you have a follow-up or not, but I just allowed you to unmute. It looks like Asa has her hand raised.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi,
I stopped the car now so I can talk. Thank you for a great presentation. Very interesting. I've been using those GoPro cameras as well for trying to catch this learning going on. And I'm so curious, did you use your material did you transcribe it or did you use it like observations? Because it's a lot of hours of film.
Yeah, it is. Well, no, I mean, and we talked about the challenges of coding, but there's the challenge. It was a bigger challenge around the video footage. So I had a lot of video footage. What I did was that with the footage is I got rid of the stuff where the coach wasn't interacting with the athlete. So I ended up with, I don't know how many vignettes of behavioral interactions. And I used that to stimulate the interview. So I recorded the interview and then I transcribed the interviews. So actually my sort of my final data was five transcribed interviews with the coaches. Still got all the video footage that I used to drive the interviews. And interestingly, I've used some of that footage with their permission. I've used some of that footage as a training tool in lectures and workshops to try and bring to life some of the discussion around the words. You know, what do we mean by perspective? Well, here's the behavior. This is what happened on the mountain when the coach said, I was taking a big picture perspective. So we watched the footage and we can understand it in a bit more depth. But yeah, the data I ended up with, Asa, was transcribed interview data.
Because you can use the data in two ways. Even if you haven't been there, you've been talking to them, and it's you get one more perspective. I think it's a good thing to use those GoPro cameras, and I think they don't really think about the camera when they wear it for a long time, and they use it for some other things as well. So it's not that big of a deal to have those cameras on, I think.
I agree.
That's
I think,
experience.
Yeah, over a period of time, they forget that they're there and they behave pretty naturally. And it's a great way as a training device to then show the instructor back the way they behaved. I think, you know, it's a great training tool, that is.
To go back to. Yeah, thank you so much.
A pleasure. It sounds like you're doing some interesting work.
It's in Swedish. I should have been writing it in English.
Oh, I don't know.
I can't share it really. I have to do that. Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Wonderful. Anything else from our illustrious board or our special guest, Jazz Bruce, in the house? Because we are just over our hour's time. Fabulous. Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. Super detailed presentation. Great work. Exciting to see where it goes. And congratulations on your PhD as well. Keep an eye out, everybody, for a continued series from our IAESS webinar series. We want to continue through the summer. We plan to also continue our interski themed presentations as well as, and then we also ask that of you, our member associations and countries, to please reach out if you have some great ideas for some subject matter experts or speakers that could join us in a future webinar. But all for now, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you so much. And thanks again to Paul.
Thanks all. Thanks, Dave.